All right, today we're digging into a really compelling analysis of the 2025 elections. It puts forward this fascinating theory that American politics just went through a massive, fundamental shift, something the source material calls the Personhood Correction.
So, let's just jump right in with a huge question that basically flips decades of political wisdom on its head. What if big money just doesn't win elections anymore? The whole idea here is that the 2025 election cycle revealed this stunning paradox where, get this, the biggest spenders often became the biggest losers. And we're going to explore exactly why.
And that's what this analysis calls the Personhood Correction. But what's really interesting is how they frame it. This isn't some kind of revolution. It's more like a recalibration. It's like democracy's own immune system finally kicking in when our institutions get way too disconnected from the actual value and dignity of human beings. Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at how this so-called correction even showed up. Then, we'll take a little trip back in time to someone named Eugene V. Debs. After that, we'll dive into something called the Gaza effect and why it was such a big deal. Then, we get to the juicy part, why big money just stopped working. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at what this new moral compass could mean for all of us.
So the story goes that in late 2025, something started happening. Across hundreds of elections, from local school boards to state houses, a really clear pattern started to emerge. It was like voters were suddenly making decisions based on a whole new set of values, ones that went way beyond party lines and started to question the whole idea of big money politics.
And this really gets to the heart of it. You had all this campaign cash flooding in. You had all these sophisticated algorithms trying to persuade people, and yet something much older, much quieter won out. It was as if voters all at once decided to run an audit of the soul on democracy itself, putting human values back on top above corporate influence.
Okay, so if this was a moral correction, you got to ask, where did that moral framework even come from? Well, the analysis points to a kind of surprising historical figure, Eugene V. Debs. Yeah, a socialist and labor leader from over a century ago, whose ideas, it turns out, might just be the intellectual foundation for this whole shift.
And this quote, it really sums up his whole philosophy. He wasn't just talking about economics. He was saying, hey, we're all in this together, that our humanity is all interconnected. And that very idea, that an injustice to one person devalues all of us, that seems to be the exact sentiment that came roaring back with such force in 2025.
So his entire political view was built on these three core ideas. And his big critique, this idea of corporate persons getting more rights than actual human workers, well, that suddenly feels incredibly relevant today, right? Especially in a world still shaped by things like Citizens United.
All right, so you might be wondering, how does an idea from 100 years ago suddenly catch fire now? Well, the analysis pinpoints a very specific tipping point. They call it the Gaza effect. And this is where a conflict happening thousands of miles away became a powerful and deeply personal issue right here at home, all thanks to modern technology.
The way it worked was pretty simple, but unbelievably powerful. You had this constant, unfiltered stream of videos and images coming from Gaza right to people's phones. It just completely burst that bubble that usually protects us from the raw, brutal reality of war. The official stories and press releases, they just couldn't keep up with what people were seeing with their own two eyes.
All of this constant exposure created what the paper calls a legitimacy debt. Think of it like a massive gap opening up between what officials were saying and what a growing number of people were feeling was right. Suddenly, empathy, which is normally this private, individual feeling, it became this huge, visible public force that started to drive real political action. And this wasn't just some abstract theory. It had direct results at the ballot box. You just have to look at Zohar Mamani's absolutely stunning mayoral victory in New York City. He took this clear, unapologetic stance on universal human rights, especially his position on Gaza, and that message just resonated with voters on a level that money couldn't buy. It was a massive signal that the political ground was shifting.
So this moral shift didn't just happen in the abstract. It had a real, measurable impact on one of the oldest rules in politics, that cash is king. Well, in 2025, according to this analysis, that rule was decisively broken.
Okay, get ready for this, because this statistic is pretty jaw-dropping. Across the top 50 city-level races in the country, the candidates who lost spent on average almost 3 times more for every single vote than the candidates who won. Just let that sink in for a second. And you can see that huge disconnect right here. Look at the towering bar for the losers' spending compared to the winners. It's not just that the money was ineffective. It's like voters got really, really good at sniffing out inauthentic, high-priced manipulation. You just couldn't buy your way in with a weak message anymore.
So what you're seeing here are really the two competing models that were battling it out. On one side, you've got the old corporate persona, funded by special interests, all about buying ads, basically a confession of who the candidate really serves. But on the other side, you've got human personhood, powered by small donors, real authenticity, something that feels like shared hope. And in 2025, the human model just kept winning.
And look, this wasn't just a New York phenomenon. The same pattern was reportedly showing up all over the country. In Pennsylvania, voters fought back against a ton of corporate cash to keep their Supreme Court justices. In Minneapolis, you had grassroots groups going up against huge money from real estate and police lobbies, and winning. The evidence was pointing to a broad national shift.
So what does this all mean for the future? What's the big takeaway? Well, the analysis argues that the personhood correction has effectively hit the reset button on democracy's moral compass. And the long-term implications, well, we're just beginning to understand them.
This new voter energy is already creating some powerful pressure for change in huge policy areas. All of a sudden, you're hearing these loud, energized calls for real campaign finance reform, for actually conditioning foreign aid on human rights, and for strengthening protections for the right to vote itself.
And a new political math is emerging from all this, and it's really the core takeaway here. The risk of appearing like you just don't care about human suffering now seems to outweigh the old risk of challenging powerful lobbies. In this new landscape, having moral courage is actually becoming a form of career insurance.
So let's end by coming full circle, back to Eugene V. Debs and his really thought-provoking idea that democracy is the organization of kindness at scale. The 2025 elections, when you look at them through this lens, really suggest that voters have started to demand exactly that. The big question we're left with is whether our political institutions are ready to listen.